Hi, my name is Lonnie Crassa, and I'm a computer science major. For my thesis, I looked into how limited neural capacity and hyperexcitability leads to impaired quantity processing. So I became interested in impaired quantity processing while working in Santa Clara's Lab of Cognitive and Computational Neuroscience, where I worked with my PI, Dr. Chen, and my research partner, Tanaz Azimi, on a similar project. Um, so when I'm talking about uh, impaired quantity processing, I'm mostly just talking about dyscalculia. So, dyscalculia is a neurodevelopmental disorder in which quantity processing is impaired. So, many people have never heard of dyscalculia. I think it's easiest to understand if you compare it to a similar disorder, dyslexia. So, dyslexia is a well known disorder that impairs language processing while dyscalculia impairs quantity processing. So while people with dyslexia have trouble reading and writing, people with dyscalculia have persistent issues with arithmetic and numbers, despite having typical intelligence and schooling. Though dyscalculia affects around 3 to 6% of children, it is extremely understudied. There is no consensus on the cause of dyscalculia, although there are a few leading theories. Existing theories argue that the impairments observed in dyscalculia are caused by either neurobiological deficiency or by the imbalance of excitatory and inhibitory signals in the neural system. So it's really difficult to test these theories in human subjects because, for example, we can't ethically impair neural capacity in human brains just to see what happens. So for my thesis, I created and manipulated a computational model of the brain. Deep, convolu- Deep convolutional neural network models, such as the one I used in this study, are made of machine learning algorithms modeled after the brain. They are made up of interconnected nodes, just as the brain is made up of interconnected neurons. In general, models like these can learn to categorize images based on a training set. For example, you could put in a ton of labeled images of cats and dogs to train the model. And then later, when an unlabeled image is inputted, the model could categorize it as either a cat or a dog. So you can see that happening in this top image. They're inputting a picture of a cat. It's going through these different layers. And then these dots are the units. It's picking up different parts of information from this photo of the cat. And then based on its training, it can output correctly that it was indeed a cat. Um, but any model is only as good as its training set, so it could categorize incorrectly if a tricky image is inputted. For example, this dog here has pointy ears, so if it didn't get trained that well, maybe it's going to go through these layers and these nodes are going to pick up those pointy ears and label it incorrectly as a cat. So for my study, the model was repeatedly trained instead on images of either non-symbolic or symbolic quantities. Non-symbolic quantity processing uses concrete objects. An example of this could be me doing math on my fingers. I can tell that 5 fingers is a bigger quantity than 3 fingers. And so this type of quantity processing, I'm using each object to understand the quantity. But then another type of quantity processing is symbolic quantity processing, which instead uses abstract forms of number processing, such as Arabic numerals. So an example of this would be if I was doing a written math test and I could read the numbers 5 and 3 off the page and associate them with the quantity that they represent. So symbolic and non-symbolic quantity processing are thought to be impacted unequally by dyscalculia, which is why I trained the model separately for each processing type. So for the non-symbolic training, I inputted images of dot arrays, such as the one down here. There's 5 red dots. One of them is pretty small, but there's 5 there. And for the symbolic training, I inputted images of handwritten Arabic numerals. So that's what you see on top, the 4, 7, 1, 8. And then in the model down here, my model, you can see if we input that image of the 5 dots, it should go through all of the layers and output the number 5 as it's labeled. So because features of the model mimic features of the brain, I ran multiple trials with different settings to examine 2 particular features' effect on accuracy. So I tested the effect of neural capacity by manipulating the number of units, and I manipulated the system excitability by manipulating the slope of activation. The units are analogous to the number of neurons that are connected to the same region of the image. So we can see that here, as I said before, these dots on this layer are the units. And the higher the unit number, the more neurons are activated for certain features of the input image. So then below, the slope represents the excitation-inhibition imbalance that may be involved with hyper and hypoactivation in dyscalculic brains. A shallow slope models hypoactivation, and a steep slope models hyperactivation. So you can see in these tables, I completed 2 separate studies with the model, one with symbolic and one with non-symbolic images. So for each study, I ran the model with 6 different combinations of unit and slope settings, and each version of the model was trained and tested 9 times. So you can see on the left side, number of units, it could be 8, 32, or 64, so we have 3 different numbers of units that we can test with a default slope of 1, and then after that, we used a default number of units of 64 and tested the different slopes of 0.5, 1, and 2. And then after running this 9 times, at the end of each run, you get an accuracy of how well was the model actually doing at categorizing the images of the numbers or the quantities. So we took the mean for each of the 9 runs for each combination of settings. So you could see like a mean of 0.93 meant that it was accurate like 93% of the time. So if you're inputting a ton of dot images, 93% of the time, it could give you the correct number of dots in that image. So here is just the results on a graph. You can see for the units in both the non-symbolic and the symbolic trials, it's not like a huge difference in accuracy. And then the reason why it's a slope is because the model is learning from its mistakes, basically. So if it's categorizing the images correctly or incorrectly, it then uses that knowledge to make itself better for future ones. So you get your final accuracy at the end, which is closer to 100%. And then for the slope, you can see there's more of a clear difference for one of the lines, which is the blue line on the bottom, which is a slope of 2. So the highest slope actually resulted in the lowest accuracy. So this simulation shows pretty much no evidence that neural capacity impacts math learning, but suggested that over-excitability from the slope may have a role in compromising learning, especially in the non-symbolic form of quantity knowledge. Thus, our results supported the EI imbalance theory, positing that the cognitive impairment in dyscalculia could result from excessive excitatory signals in the brains of affected individuals. The EI imbalance theory has been proposed to explain various neurodevelopmental disorders, including dyscalculia, as well as other orders such as autism spectrum disorder. Neurons in our brain are constantly either responding or not responding to stimuli. So if the ratio between excitation and inhibition becomes too high, the neurons are going to be responding way more to stimuli. And this might initially seem like a good thing because maybe we'd assume that the more information and the more action our brains are taking to the stimuli, that might help us with math tasks. But it can also cause overstimulation because if our brains are over-responding to unnecessary information, it can confuse us and make it harder to make judgments about quantities and arithmetic. Like for non-symbolic quantities, as I said before, I'm looking at 5 and I just know that it's bigger than 3. And this is kind of just like a split-second judgment that I can make because I can understand these 2 quantities. But if you think about it, if I was having too much information and I was responding to too much stimuli and like unrelated, irrelevant things, that might make comparisons or quantity processing in general a lot harder. So though neural network models can help us investigate aspects of the brain, they also have limitations. They're not brains, so they're not as complex as human brains, and they're limited to the data that we input, which is subject to bias and human error. Hopefully, future research can further test the EI imbalance theory in dyscalculia. Thank you.